Big Cup and hello! Welcome back to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. A few months ago, we had an entire episode where we closely analyzed the tight relationship and mother-daughter best friendship dynamic between Lorelai and Rory. But this week, we're going the opposite direction and talking about all the ways they're different and how their life paths diverge. I've heard so much discourse about how Rory is just a mini Lorelai, and I would like to dispel the myth that she's somehow a carbon copy of her mother, and therefore that her sharing the same fate as a single mother in Stars Hollow, who has her own versions of Christopher and Luke, is somehow a fitting end for her, a completion of the circle of life.
Eye rolling. But before we get started, just a reminder that this is a spoilers all podcast. We'll of course be talking about the show from the pilot to those final 4 words for this one. So if you don't want to know what happens, you might want to come back to this episode once you finish the show. And if you could do all of the YouTube-y things, like this video, share it, subscribe to our channel, drop us a comment, we would be eternally grateful for the support. It means a lot, and it really does help us out. Now, let's get to the synopses for this week's episodes.
All right, this week we are up to Season 3, Episode 7. They shoot Gilmores, don't they? Lorelai wants to participate in the town's 24-hour dance marathon and is gunning to win, but her partner abandons her when his wife finds out how attractive she is. Lorelai ropes Rory into participating with her, but when Dean and Jess both show up as spectators, sparks start to fly. Rory, ranting about Jess and Shane, tips Dean over the edge, and he breaks up with her right there in front of everyone. Jess finds Rory on the bridge, and she confirms that she and Dean are really broken up, so he goes to break up with Shane so he can finally be with Rory. Jackson informs Suki that he wants, quote-unquote, 4 in 4, 4 kids in 4 years. Suki confides this to Lorelai and uses her as a scapegoat in telling Jackson she doesn't want that many kids, which angers Jackson because he thinks it's none of her business. Kirk wins the dance marathon for the 5th year in a row and does his traditional victory lap to the Rocky theme song.
This is followed up by Let the Games Begin, and Richard invites Rory to Yale under the guise of wanting to show her the campus while he's there for a reunion of the Whiffenpoofs. They are having a nice day and sharing anecdotes, including the story of Richard and Emily's proposal, until it's revealed the whole thing is a manipulation in order to force Rory to have an interview with the Dean of Admissions, who happens to be a friend of Richard's. Case in point, Lorelai called it ahead of time because she knew better what Richard was up to. Lorelai and Rory leave campus in a taxi and stop at Hector's for tacos on the way home. Rory and Jess share, ostensibly, their first real kiss as a couple, and Rory goes to Dean's to talk to him and apologize, telling him that he was the best boyfriend and that she hopes someday he can forgive her.
Yeah, this is an excellent batch of episodes. Just throwing that out there. 2 of my faves. I love these ones. Yeah. But we're here to talk about Lorelai and Rory. We hear a lot about how, like, they're basically the same person. And I find the comparisons between them a little bit odd. Like, even though they're mother and daughter, and they have superficial similarities, like their appearance and their love of pop culture, like, they're very different people with very different life trajectories. By the age of 32, Lorelai had worked her way up in the professional world without going to college and while having to raise a kid on her own. Rory, on the other hand, was self-entitled and was perfectly okay with being unemployed and adrift because she seemed to always think that whatever she wants would eventually come along and someone would save her. Like, Lorelai knew she had to save herself, and Rory never seems to have received that message. So we're going to go kind of like almost point by point with all of those things and like go into a little more depth about them. But it's one of those things where it feels very superficial to compare them like that. When you look at it higher level, you're like, oh wow, their lives went very differently. So why don't we just kind of start from the beginning? Let's start with the fact that, like, Lorelai was born to rich parents in Hartford in the 60s and grew up in the 70s and 80s. And Rory kind of came of age in the 90s. And, so there was very different cultures, like trends and beliefs and thoughts during those times. And, let's also, like, I'll let you talk about sort of the difference in parenting styles. Like, talk a little bit about Emily versus Lorelai as parents and sort of maybe how that impacted them early on.
Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, for anyone who has seen the show, you know that, for the first year of Rory's life, Lorelai was still living with Emily and Richard under their roof. It wasn't until those first few months had passed that Lorelai actually left and took Rory away, which I think is important, because had Lorelai not made that choice, Rory would have grown up under that roof and under that same umbrella privilege that Lorelai had known her entire life. So the first deviation is that Lorelai is removing Rory from that financial stability and from that upper social class and choosing to raise her in a way that might have been problematic, I say, because, you were living in a shed with your child for years, and that's certainly not ideal. But the first, again, deviation is that Lorelai was raised privileged and with financial padding in terms of what her parents could provide for her, a roof over her head, and a nice one at that. And Rory was raised, again, in a shed with a mother and a single parent who was just going paycheck to paycheck to make ends meet, who Rory was never involved in any of those sort of like social engagements that Lorelai was involved in growing up, from cotillions to debutante balls to coming out parties to attending just birthday parties, probably, that are just not even birthday parties, but just social events to put money in each other's pockets. Rory only really knew Lorelai as her mother and then Lane as a friend, and that was seemingly the only social interactions that she had growing up, which was also in direct contrast from what Lorelai had. But to go back to your question, let's talk about the parenting styles. Absolutely. Because Lorelai was a very, very present mother, and she had to be, because she was all Rory had. Christopher was not in the picture. She didn't have Rory did not have a father figure, even if Christopher hadn't been there. Lorelai was her worldview. That was all that she knew. You could make the argument, and it's not a bad one, I would agree with you, that Emily was not a present mother. But at least Lorelai was growing up in a 2-parent household where she had double the support. If she needed to call upon it, it was there for her. But I want to ask you about that too, because do you think that even though Rory was being raised in a single-parent household, that she actually had more support just from one parent than Lorelai did from having 2?
Obviously, we don't have all the information on Rory's childhood, but my guess would actually be yes. I mean, but it's hard to say, and it depends on how you define support as well, because obviously we know that Lorelai's parenting philosophy is supportive itself. It's very much so, I want you to be whoever you're going to be, and I'm going to support you no matter what. Like, as long as you're happy, I'm happy. So that side of things, definitely. She had more emotional support from one parent than Lorelai did from both of hers. But then there's the other side of support, which is, presence in her life. And if she's working so hard to provide financially for them both, how much was she really there? But I think that's maybe where Stars Hollow steps in, and it takes a village of it all comes into play, because despite the fact that Lorelai was sort of subjected to all of these different kinds of social engagements growing up, it's different being social and kind of having to do all of those things that are expected of you. As you mentioned, the debutantes and the cotillions and the like boring AF birthday parties that are just like half kids and half old guys. I don't understand that. There's a difference between that and community, which is what Lorelai and Rory had in Stars Hollow. So there was a lot more of sort of a general support network and a feeling of like warmth and compassion and care from the people around them, as opposed to this sort of like cold, sterile social environment that she was experiencing in Hartford. So I guess it depends, like I said, how you define it and which of those you want to lean on. But I think in general, it's clear based on how Rory feels about her mom versus how Lorelai feels about her mom that there was just a lot more care, concern, compassion, understanding there, all of which are sort of part and parcel of support.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I think that brings us right into socialization for children, which Lorelai would have been very socialized, whether she wanted it or not, from, again, just her parents planning their own social engagements, attending other, wealthy, prosperous families, whether it's like, again, birthday parties, just, a get together. Lorelai would have been very socialized and thrown into a social class of well-to-dos. Again, we don't see a lot of Rory's childhood, but we have to assume, based on the information that we're given, that aside from attending school and potentially socializing with her peers in that regard, she didn't get that same level of socialization. That's very clear cut. But do you think it was better for Rory to not have that same socialization that Lorelai did? Or do you think that Lorelai actually probably benefited from it more, even though it was amongst people that we may not want to spend time with fully? But do you think it was better for Lorelai to have what she had, or better for Rory to just socialize on her own terms?
Again, this depends on how you want to define benefited from these things. At least as the debutante ball was presented to us in season 2, if that was the tenor of all of the things that Lorelai was going to, I don't see how that's necessarily beneficial to the psyche of a young woman or a young man or anything, just the idea. It's like, hi, I'm, available and almost of marriageable age and come from good breeding. It's kind of gross. And, it harkens back to the days when women were still property. So we don't like to perpetuate that. Then again, you meet people. It is just an excuse to be social in a lot of ways and an excuse to wear a pretty dress. So on that level, that's fun. It probably did teach her sort of how to navigate some social situations with grace and charm. So that could have come out of it. But going to sort of like the second part of your question, it probably was better for Rory to be raised out of it and to just be allowed to discover her own interests away from all of the expectation of that kind of socialization, because that seemed to be part of what caused Lorelai some of the most psychological distress. Was like, I'm expected to do all these things and I think it's crap and I don't want to be here. I don't want to be doing this. I don't like it. It's not the life I want for myself, but I don't know how to get away from it except to run away. And so I think that Lorelai allowing Rory to dictate the terms of her own socialization and to be comfortable spending time with herself and also being a part of a community like Stars Hollow, where participation is valued but not expected. Well, it's kind of expected a little bit, not in the same way, right? Like, it's a much different thing to participate in, the charity food drive for Thanksgiving than it is to go to a debutante ball. And I think, that sort of small town communal vibe was ultimately a lot better for Rory in general, and to allow her to pick and choose what she participated in as she got older and was just more aware of her options and how to navigate these things without it sort of really imprinting on her too young. I mean, obviously we see how she turns out, and she does seem to take to it quite a bit more than Lorelai, for sure. And it does seem to have an impact on how she feels and how she moves through the world. But I think if she had been part of it earlier, it might have been even worse for her. She might have turned out more like Paris or Francie or someone like that, if that makes sense. So, yeah. But like, that brings me to something else. Like, I had a thought as I was talking. Obviously, Lorelai rebelled against that, and Rory was very much a goody-goody. She had a good relationship with her mom, a good relationship with the town. She was, the little town angel. Do you have any sort of takes on the rebellion aspect of things between the two of them?
Well, yeah. I mean, Lorelai was put into a cage, and it wasn't a cage that she wanted to be in. And I think the point of emphasis there is that it was not a cage that she wanted to be in. And that's, well, it was, yeah, it's a cage because she didn't want it.
Yeah, this isn't Miss Patty dancing in a cage for Tito Puente. Like,
good one. But yeah, I mean, opinions aside, had Lorelai embraced that upbringing and actually found joy and, enjoyed going to those sorts of birthday parties and debutantes and social engagements and coming out, had that actually been, a fun time for her, that would have been a very different result, because then she wouldn't have likely rebelled. She probably would have stayed, under Emily and Richard's roof. But it was because she was so disdainful of that upbringing and of being forced into all of those social situations and that life that Emily and Richard wanted for her, but it wasn't the life that she wanted for herself. She felt herself being, again, I don't know what better way to put it, just forced into this cage where the padlock's on and there's literally just no way for you to get out or break free. And I just think she was probably trying to pick the lock every single day and was just so unsuccessful, and then stressed because she couldn't get out of the cage that she was in. So when she finally had an opportunity to break free from it, she ran. She wasn't just walking away saying, like, questioning, am I doing the right thing? Like, I'm leaving a lot of privilege. I'm leaving a very big safety net, security net in terms of well-being and financial stability. She had no second thoughts when she left with Rory. She just bolted and ran for the hills. And it was because she, I think, had felt so constricted for so much of her life, even after Rory was born, that stress and that unpleasantness and that unhappiness just had her sprinting. And I can understand why, because again, that was not the life that she wanted to live. And so when you're being when your life is being compartmentalized and you're being put into that box and you're having these expectations set on you and saying, and having your own parents saying, like, I don't really care what you want. This is about what I want for you in your life, and your considerations and your desires are secondary. I think any child who was feeling that way and in that situation would rebel and run away in the same way that Lorelai did. Now, to contrast that, Lorelai's parenting of Rory was very different, where she let Rory seemingly make all of her own choices about how she wanted to spend her time, about her own hobbies, about her own social engagements, whether she wanted to be social or not. And so I think that's the biggest difference, where Rory had that autonomy as a child to make her own choices and live, even as a youth, her own life. And for Lorelai, it was never about what I want. It's just always what Emily and Richard want for me. And so, of course, she's going to rebel in that situation because her life is not her own. And she needed it to be her own at that point. It was 16 years overdue and in the making. So, yeah, of course she's going to run.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And Rory never had to, because she had such a good relationship with her mom that she never felt like any of her decisions were going to, like, disappoint her necessarily. Like, Rory was so self-motivated and she wanted to make her mom happy and proud, and she wanted them to be a team. But Lorelai's more permissive parenting style and their strong bond allowed them to work through things together, instead of Rory always needing to kind of cut her own path away from her mom. So she was far more, it's right, she didn't have as many rules, but she was more rule abiding. She held herself to a different set of standards, I guess, maybe. And, Lorelai was just happy that she was or that she had a good head on her shoulders. So we never really saw that sort of same irreverent behavior or attitude toward that social conformity. And it was almost like a rebellion against Lorelai when Rory did start to enjoy some of the upper crust activities. Like, she didn't hate her time at the country club, although I don't know if it was the country club so much as just having a good time with Richard and feeling closer to him. And then when she goes to Yale, like, this whole other world starts opening up to her after living in a small town and going to small schools for the most part. Very Stars Hollow has a small population, so that's going to be a small school, and Chilton is very selective, so small in different ways. And then now she's a small fish in a big pond, and she starts to branch out a little bit, but I still wouldn't call it rebellion. But I think that's also a good segue into education. Like, how different were their educational paths?
I mean, for the first 15 years of Rory's life, very different. For the last 3 years of Rory's high school education, probably actually pretty similar. But we'll start with the first 15 years of Rory's life. I think we have to assume that she was attending Stars Hollow, and integrated into the Stars Hollow public school system from the time that she was, 5, 6, and started going to school. So she was in public schools. And even as I say that, I just think of Emily and Richard being public. Excuse, what? Do you know what kind of kids go to public schools?
All the ruffians.
Yeah. I again, we don't know Lorelai's early childhood in that regard, but I think it's a safe bet that she was probably going to those sort of private academia, perhaps even religious-based schools, or just Montessori programs, or just, stuff where it's I want my child to have the best chance at success that they can possibly have. And that's all fine and well, but you put such pressures and expectations on your kid from such an early age to be successful when you do that those sorts of schools, I think, almost the implementation of the need for that child to be successful is so fierce and heavy that when that child fails, it's an enormous weight that's put on that child that can be really detrimental. But even some schools will just be if your kid doesn't meet the standards that we have, your kid can get out. And there are schools that are telling parents that as early as 3, 4, 5, your child needs to meet our standards or they can't attend here. And your kid's 3. They're just learning how to go to the bathroom on their own. And you're going to, be that rigorous. And so many things can just go wrong. But that's its own separate topic. But yeah, I think Lorelai was definitely probably in a privatized educational system her whole life. Rory never had that. And then we see her going to Chilton when she's 15. And I mean, look at how Emily and Richard light up Christmas trees when they find out that Rory's going to Chilton. It's oh, Chilton, that's one of the best private schools in the country. She's going to get such a good education there. She's going to have such great opportunities. And at that point, Emily and Richard are just really getting to know their granddaughter again and have her be a constant presence in their life. It's are you happy for your granddaughter because she's receiving a really good opportunity for herself? Or are you happy because it's going to make you look better? And you can say, our granddaughter goes to Chilton. She's top of her class. She has a 4.0. I think over time, they grew to really be proud of Rory for what she accomplished on her own and were invested in wanting her to be successful. But I think in season 1, especially as she's starting Chilton, it was more about how it was going to make Emily and Richard look and how they could now brag to their friends about their granddaughter. And you're diminishing Rory when you do that, because you're making it not about her opportunities or how she can prosper, but just about how it makes you look. It was probably the same thing they did to Lorelai her entire life.
Yeah, it's funny. In Secrets and Loans, when Rory gets her PSAT scores back and they're really good, Lorelai's like, remember to gloat a little. It's good for the skin. And I'm like, is that why Emily looks so good?
Probably.
Yeah, all that gloating about Rory and Chilton has certainly put some pep in their step and, given them something to be glowing about. But yeah, all good points. And we contrast that to Lorelai, who doesn't even finish high school. She drops out. I'm wondering, I don't really know. I suppose it's going to differ basically anywhere. There's probably no uniformity to the situation. But Lorelai sort of makes a snarky comment at some point. I can't remember exactly when, like to the tune of like, they wouldn't let me come to class and nurse you at the same time. And so I wonder if it's just that sort of like private school mentality. Because I know that like some teenage girls do go back to school and finish and sometimes even bring their kids, or like the school will have a daycare or some sort of setup for people who have children. And so I don't think Lorelai had that option. So she drops out. She gets her GED eventually, whereas Rory is valedictorian at one of the most prestigious private schools possibly in America. So, Rory was able to focus on her academics. She was supported academically instead of pushed academically. And she wanted to go to an Ivy League so bad that she really put in that effort. Whereas Lorelai was like, I just have to do whatever it takes to like survive basically and to make sure we have what we need. And then moving on from that, we have the university years. And so Lorelai didn't have the typical college experience. She eventually was able to enter herself at the Hartford Community College. She got an AA degree in business. She graduated. We saw that happen, and it was a great episode. I love that one. But then the end of season 3, we have Rory's graduation, and it's a very different vibe. You get Lorelai's kind of like cramped room in some sort of big public building, whereas Rory is in this like beautiful courtyard surrounded by this 200-year-old building, and the guys are all talking about how much money it costs to insure. Just very different experiences of academics for both of them around the same time, which is funny. And Rory obviously goes on very prominently to Yale. She gets into Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and ends up at Yale, just like her grandfather. There's that legacy for you. And according to the song that Emily and Richard sing for her at her graduation from Yale in season 7, she finished Phi Beta Kappa, which is, I don't even remember. I think I have this in my notes for like university experiences, but it's like top percentages of top schools. So she is very high up there when it comes to academic achievement. So we have someone who scrappily worked her way up and like put herself through school. And then we have another who is like, we're going to like scrape together the money to give you private school and Ivy League education. Here it is, silver platter, like cheat code to life. And yet we see where Rory ends up.
Yeah, but let's talk about that now. Education flowing directly into a career path and job opportunities and employment. For as much of a leg up as Rory got in terms of attending Chilton and attending Yale and having her privatized education be fully financed, where she never really had to shell out a penny for it, in my mind, like, you lose, good day, sir. She was failing at jumpstarting a career path directly out of college. And for even Lorelai getting her GED and then attending business school later on, once Rory is a little bit more grown and able to fend for herself, she was more successful than Rory was in terms of having a stable job, a constant and steady paycheck. That stability was there for her more than it ever was for Rory. And we can certainly talk about, and we have in the past, about how Rory was entitled, too lazy for her own good at times, wanting things to be, or expecting things to be put in front of her on a silver platter. And when the world didn't present itself in that way to her as she wanted it to, she just didn't know how to handle it and didn't know how to circumvent it in a way that would garner her the success that she needed. And Lorelai was scrappy and resourceful in that regard, where if something wasn't working out for her, she figured out how to make it work. She didn't, go wallow and cry and say, like, the world isn't catering to me and I don't know how to handle it or what to do about it. Lorelai's like, the world isn't catering to me right now, so I need to figure out how I'm going to make it do so. I can't let myself break down. I need to figure out a solution. Whereas Rory just shut down. But talk to me about what you think too about how their career paths and how their jobs and their mindset with those jobs, again, allowed them to be two different people and not the same as the fandom wants to make them out to be.
Right. Everything you said was spot on. Like, Lorelai left home at 17, went to a place she had never been to, found a random business, knocked on the door, begged for a job, any job, and she took a low-paying job as a maid because it was money, and Mia was there to help her and support her through that. And she just worked her way up. I don't know if they ever really told us Lorelai's dreams for life. Like, what was she dreaming of when she was a kid? Because we know Rory's wanted to be a foreign correspondent for a long time. That was just sort of like all over the place. It comes up so many times, whereas we never really get Lorelai's childhood dreams. And, obviously being a maid at an inn probably wasn't it. And I don't even know that being a manager or an owner of an inn was what she wanted to do originally. I think it was something that she stumbled into, discovered she had a talent for it, and enjoyed it because it allowed her to be social and it allowed her to work with some of her best friends. And she just ran with it. She absolutely made it work. She worked her way up. She was trusted and beloved by the staff and by the owners. And eventually that led to her being able to start and manage her own business. She got out. And you look at Rory, and so she had some like part stuff. High school, she worked in pocket money. She was briefly a card swiper at the Yale dining hall, and even when she was doing that, she was like on her cell phone half the time and was like, "Swipe them yourselves, people! Like, don't be mice." Then we have the infamous internship situation. After taking off to Europe for the summer and not working, not getting any experience or anything like her cohort was getting at the same time, she gets this internship from Mitchum and does a good job, but doesn't necessarily recognize that the feedback she's getting could actually be constructive to her about her suitability for a job like this. She just takes it very personally and obviously reacts poorly. And yet it still doesn't really make her rethink the journalism path whatsoever. And so when she graduates, she continues on that path, and she doesn't get the Reston Fellowship. She takes the job on the Obama campaign. Then we have a few nights where we're like, just not sure what we know that she wrote some articles for Slate and Atlantic, and obviously there was the Talk of the Town piece in the New Yorker, and then we have the revival. So the failed project with Naomi, the failed GQ article. And then she takes a job at the Stars Hollow Gazette, working for basically nothing because she loves this newspaper, she loves her town, and she wants to keep it going. But then she sits there bitching to Jess about, like, I'm totally broke. I have no underwear. My license is expired. Like, my life is a mess. I have boxes scattered across a bunch of states. And it's like, yeah, because you're working a job that doesn't pay you. And people are trying to offer you opportunities for jobs that actually pay, or like ideas for things that might be better suited to you. And you're just like, nah, I'm just not going to do it. You know, we've had this conversation before about Headmaster Charleston and the idea of going back to be a teacher. And she just dismisses it out of hand because it's not journalism. And we'll talk about this a lot more when we have our episode all about journalism. But Rory was never able to sort of like adapt and recognize when her career was not on the right trajectory. She just had this sort of bullishness that kept her focused on like a tiny little target that was so hard to hit that she was setting herself up for failure and wasn't like recognizing that she had these blinders on that prevented her from seeing the bigger picture. Whereas Lorelai was always great about taking opportunities and, you know, thinking outside of the box and just being very creative and resourceful and working with her talents instead of against them. So yeah, I think it is probably just emblematic of the fact that Rory was told her whole life that she was special and she could do whatever she wanted without recognizing, like, not everyone in the world is going to prostrate themselves at your feet and just give you a job. Like when she goes back to the Gazette and tries to get a job from Stuart Woltz, and, you know, he's like, oh, I wish we could hire you here, but we don't have any openings. And she shows up and pesters him until they hire her, as if, like, you'd be so lucky to have me. Like, I'm the best. You need to hire me. And I'm a bargain. And then they just drop the entire plotline. We have no idea if she ever, like, contributed again to the Stanford Eagle Gazette. But she was just so used to people offering her stuff and believing in her capabilities that, you know, the minute she went out into the wider world and faced more competition, it was like, what do you mean I didn't get this job? I'm the best. Whereas Lorelai went in with a lot of humility and grit and was willing to do what it took to get where she wanted to go. And I don't think Rory ever, like, despite the fact that, like, we can see Rory is a good worker. Like, she does her homework very diligently and she does extra credit and she does summer school and she volunteers into student council and the newspaper and she volunteers in the town. Like, she's a busy kid. She has a work ethic. And so it becomes that much more surprising later in life when we see that she's floundering. And it's like, what happened to that girl who was so, like, on the ball? Where did that spirit go? And I think that's part of the reason people are so disappointed in her by the revival.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I think it also stems from the fact that Rory had this very warped mindset that, like, there were certain jobs that were just beneath her, that, like, I'll never sink myself that low or put myself in a situation where, like, I'm going to do that job. And it doesn't even need to, like, go so far as, like, so low as to say, like, oh, retail, excuse me. There are even internships that she turns down because she's just like, this feels beneath me and I'm not sure and I don't know. Like, I feel like I can do better. And so she turns down so many opportunities because the world and her mother and Stars Hollow, and we've talked about this, has put her on this egregious pedestal. But she also sees herself there. And that's equally problematic because when you're being offered internships and career opportunities that could jumpstart you and lead into something better for you down the line and in the long term, okay, so maybe you start off at a job where you're making 75% of what you envisioned yourself to be making, or maybe it is an unpaid internship, but it could lead to a paying job down the line. But it's oh, that's, again, it's just beneath me, so I don't take it. And then you wonder why you're broke with no underwear. Because just chill with the arrogance, chill with the cockiness. You're not holier than thou. And you need to take those opportunities that are presented to you, say thank you, and run with them and see where it gets you. But when you're so dismissive of everything because you think that you're better than that, you are never going to get anywhere in life. And anyone else who is surrounded by you is going to very quickly, I think, be perceptive of that attitude and be like, I don't actually want someone like that working for me, because they're just going to always have this mindset of they're the best. And that's just, again, problematic in its own way. But I think that was part of Rory's downfall, was just that she saw so many things as beneath her from a career standpoint and from a job standpoint. And Lorelai did not, very clearly. She's like, if you've got a maid or a housekeeping position going, I will take it. And I'm elated and I'm over the moon. Like, thank you. And she probably, like, look, if she had to wash dishes, she would have washed dishes. If she had to scrub toilets, and she probably did, like, she did it. And she didn't see it as beneath her. She saw it as, I'm living the life that I want to live right now. I'm free of the constraints that were previously holding me back. And so what this is doing for me mentally and emotionally is good. I'm also able to provide for my daughter. And so that's another way in which, again, these two women are night and day. One is arrogant and on a pedestal and just, the world is my oyster and it's going to be what I make of it and it's going to cater to me. And another woman is over here just like, you know, I'm going to be grateful for every opportunity that I'm given, and I'm not going to have that really toxic mindset. And I'm just going to be grateful for what I have. And so, yeah, I mean, it's very clear cut, not even from an education standpoint, but from a career standpoint, how these two women broached the opportunities that they were given and whether they were dismissive of them or not. And what they took what they were given and they turned it into something better, because Lorelai was a maid. Eventually she was running the place. Yeah. Because she humbled herself and she worked her way up. And Rory was not even to start off in that same way, where I think to equate it, Rory would have just been like, you want me to be the maid? No, I should at least be a manager at this point, or a shift lead. And if you don't have that for me and I can't start at that level, then I'm not even going to consider this. And it's like, that's why you don't have anything.
Yeah. All true. It makes me think of Rory in season 7 when, I mean, I guess this is also not an ASP season, so it's hard to say if she would have taken a different route in her final year of university. But you remember the Operation Finish Line that Paris sets up?
Mm-hmm.
And she's looking up all these options for scholarships and internships and opportunities for further study for once they're graduated. And Rory's like, I don't want to be Dan Abrams. I hate Dan Abrams. And, you know, like, Paris is thinking outside the box. And this is part of the reason why Paris ends up where she does in terms of, you know, academic and career accomplishment, is because she, like, never stops. And she is very adaptive and she thinks creatively and she puts things together. She couldn't decide whether she wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer. So she started a business where both sides of those things were integrated. And so she ended up studying both, as well as dental hygiene, I guess. And, you know, and she forged her own path from two interests and loves of hers. And so she became extremely accomplished by thinking outside the box. And she was trying to present those same opportunities to Rory, and Rory's like not taking this very seriously. And she's like, I'm just going to do this because I told Paris I would. But she doesn't apply to any master's programs. She doesn't apply to any other fellowships or further study programs, internships, nothing. The only thing we know that she did was apply to the rest of fellowship, and then she started putting her resume out at big newspapers. But she was counting on the New York Times so much that her grandparents were so sure it was going to happen that they told her they were going to buy a little pied-à-terre in the city. Like, everybody was convinced that she was just destined for the New York Times. And I think it was that mentality that held her back a lot in those early years. And I think it's part of the reason that she said no to Logan's proposal as well. I think I've mentioned this in the past, where I'm like, dude, Silicon Valley in 2007? And you didn't see any opportunity for yourself there? What? Like, how did you miss out on that? You could have been on the ground level of digital journalism and really made a name for yourself at one of these outlets that came to dominate the digital journalism sphere in the following years. But she was so stuck on this sort of like traditional idea of journalism that even though she knew that the industry was morphing so quickly and was struggling, she was like, no, I just got to hold this out because I've wanted it since I was a kid. So like, obviously I just have to like pigheadedly keep on with this. So it was just not good. And so she ends up in this sort of like string of freelance appointments where, and like, it's not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's a lot more unstable and unsure. And it's, you know, for someone with her who's a perfectionist and who seems to have some anxieties around stuff like that, it was probably not a great environment for her. She expected more stability and predictability in her career, and she didn't get it. And I think that might be part of what led to this sort of like slump in assignments, because she couldn't get the momentum with it. It's very much like, you got to go out and get this. And like, she's good when she's got something to work with, when she has a structure, but not so much when she doesn't. Whereas Lorelai can just like work on the fly. She's just so agile all the time. Just the eye is always on the prize, but she's always like checking her blind spots as well. And yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really good summarization of how these two women are different, at least from that standpoint. I do want to move us along now into comparing and contrasting their love lives.
Oh, here's where it gets juicy.
Yeah. Because this is where I think the fandom at most says like, oh, they're the same person, you know, and that's where they even bring the men into the comparisons and saying, you know, one is the other and the apple didn't fall far from the tree, and Rory's men are just, you know, Lorelai's men just playing out at a different time. And so we get all of those comparisons with, you know, just, yeah, like all of Lorelai's men and Rory's men. And we've talked about already how we hate those comparisons and how they're not truthful. But let's start out with, I want to scale us all the way back to Lorelai's love life as a teenager and how that contrasts with Rory's love life as a teenager.
Right. And I mean, just to sort of touch on what you just said, it's not that the parallels aren't there, nor that they can't be narratively interesting or illuminating about certain things, but it can get a little bit annoying when it's just sort of like used as a simple one-to-one, because I really don't think it's a one-to-one. I think the writers put all of the comparisons in there on purpose for a reason. It was very clearly done with a purpose in mind. And that's fine. But like, it's there. I'm not saying that people who see these comparisons are crazy, but I also think that the comparisons are more like varied and broad than people give them credit for. They're like, oh, this equals this and this equals this, without being like, oh, but there's also like, we'll get into this more in a minute because I do want to answer your question. But like, you know, Jess has a lot of similarities to Lorelai, as does Logan. So it's not just to Lorelai's men, but it's to Lorelai herself. And, you know, you can see like a little bit of Christopher and Luke in the different guys. So we'll come back to that. But I just wanted to sort of disclaim, like, you're not crazy if you see these these parallels because they're there. They're meant to be there. But I don't want to use them prescriptively. And I don't want to like limit them to like one track each, basically. So we'll continue on that. But answering your question, so Lorelai's sort of early love life, as far as we know it, was that she was promiscuous very early. She was sexually active, I'm guessing probably from the time she was maybe 12 or 13, just based on kind of random things that she'll say over time about different boyfriends that she had before Christopher. And so I think she got together with Chris when she was probably 15 or 16. Obviously, we know that they were sexually active with each other. And I think part of that was wanting to rebel against her upbringing and her household. And it was one of the few, I hate to phrase it this way, but one of the few weapons she could wield, like one of the few activities that she had any autonomy over at the time. It was just all she saw that she could do to make her own decisions. Whereas Rory hardly seems to know Dean exists at first. You know, she doesn't seem very interested in boys. The pilot makes her very much an N-log, where the other girls are painting their nails and she's actually doing her homework in class. And they're like, she's doing the assignment. As if like Rory has no interest in things other teenage girls are interested in, including boys. And so when Dean expresses interest, she very much has no idea what she's doing. And it takes her some time to warm up and to get used to the idea of dating, and then to be comfortable expressing her feelings and loving other people on that level. Granted, she's young. It's hard. It's, you know, it's very confusing and emotional at that time. So I don't totally blame her. But, you know, Lorelai was very comfortable with guys and with her sexuality very early, and Rory very clearly was not. So I think that's a major differentiation between them. But what about as they got older? Like, where do you see similarities or differences as they sort of move into the 18 plus adult years?
Similarities, definitely a lot of, I think, floundering and not really knowing or having an idea even in their own minds of what it is they want from, I say a man in this case because we're talking about two straight women, but not knowing that what they wanted from the men in their lives, and
or what they need from the men in their lives.
Yes. Both are like just enormously important. And I understand that as a preteen, as a teenager, perhaps even someone in your early 20s, like it's good to take the time to figure out what it is you want in a partner and someone that you are going to be in a relationship with, and what you're looking for from a personality perspective in the other person, what needs you want to have met that you can then actively look for and communicate to, like, with and to a partner about. But I'll start with Lorelai. And I think, again, this stems from getting pregnant at 16 and then having a child. So, you know, in her late teens and in her early 20s, unless like we weren't shown otherwise, but it seems like she probably wasn't really active on the dating scene because her focus and her time was just being put into raising Rory. And that was where all of her energy was focused on. And so when Rory is finally old enough to start, you know, again, being autonomous and fending for herself, and Lorelai can actively start dating again and have men in the picture because she's freer now to do so, she's like a deer caught in the headlights, where as much as she's now a woman in her early 30s, she's like, what do I do? What do I do? Like, I don't know how to broach this. I don't even think like I know what I want as a, you know, I don't know what I'm looking for in a guy because I haven't had the opportunity to take the time to explore that for myself. And so I think that's why we see a lot of her relationships fail. With Max, with Alex, with Jason, because in their own way, all of these men have good qualities. None were abusive or just detrimental to her in a way that like was a real cause for concern or a red flag. Like we talked about red flags, like not a red flag in the sense of like you're being physically abused or like, you know, you need to contact the police or like actually worry about this person and on that level. But because Lorelai didn't know what she wanted in a partner, her relationships failed because she was, I think, at times so happy to just be with somebody that she was dismissive of the incompatibility, because it's like, this dude's here and he's present. And so he's not right for me, but I don't even think she was able to recognize that for herself because she was still, as a woman in her 30s, so inexperienced in the dating game and in love life and in what to try and seek out in a partner. And I think Rory, unfortunately, and this is where I will agree that there is perhaps some overlap, fell into a similar situation where, yes, Dean was a great first boyfriend. Lorelai, I think, was correct in that regard. But I don't think that Rory, even for herself, took enough time to do that introspection and explore what it is that she was seeking out in a partner. And I think, you know, then you have Jess come along, and I will say, I think that I stand by my sentiment. Jess was the best of all of them, and the best person for her out of the men that she was presented with. But I'll say too, like, you know, you can just go into it and be like, oh, he likes books, I like books, we're meant for each other. And it's like, no, it doesn't work that way. And I think sometimes she was even so inexperienced where she took the most basic of commonalities and thought like, oh, this person's right for me because we have a few basic things in common and a few basic interests that align. And it's like a relationship and love takes so much more than that. There's more than just having 4 or 5 things that in common. And I think even when she eventually starts to date Logan, I think she's still just, she's gotten a little better about doing that work and finding out and exploring what her needs are. But she still is just so a fish out of water to me in terms of you don't even know what you want. So how can you expect a man to fulfill needs and meet needs for you when you don't even know what those needs yourself are?
Yeah. I think Logan is maybe one of the like big examples of a place where they diverge from each other, because Lorelai is just so focused on Rory for those first like 15 years. And she dates casually, but was never really serious about anyone. Very few guys were ever really brought home. She had never lived with a man or anything like that. And so Rory, being 21 and moving in with her boyfriend, was like a big deal for her. It's a big difference. You know, we get in season 2 when Lorelai and Max are engaged, and Max is like, why don't I stay the night? Let's have a test run. We've been over how that's problematic. But that moment, it's very clear that like Lorelai's never lived with a guy before, and she's 32. I mean, granted, I'm 33 and I've never lived with a partner. Like, you know, that's still on the horizon for me too. It's not like a judgment, but it's just a contrast to Rory, who was much younger when she moved in with Logan, and she lived with him for several months, like the better part of like a year and a half, I think, that they lived together or saw each other regularly. I mean, Logan was a little all over the place, so it's not a straight timeline, but she had that experience much sooner. And so when Logan proposes at the end of season 7, it's it's him coming to her from a place of, we've been together 3 years. I love you. I see a future with you. I just want to be with you and for us to move forward together. That felt, granted, they're still really young and like, I don't know how I feel about that on the whole, but it felt a lot better than Chris standing next to Lorelai in the nursery at the hospital being like, well, I guess we should get married. It was a very different scenario and a very different vibe where Rory got that sort of like chance to mature and learn how to live with a partner much sooner than Lorelai did. And so that's part of what kept Lorelai so stunted, was kind of having a rule against having guys in the house. It wasn't so much that like she couldn't or didn't want to, but like she had it so on the back burner that it didn't happen for her until later. And that's fine. That happens to some of us, case in point. But it just was an experience that Rory had that put her in a very different position. And she had the choice of whether or not to marry Logan, as opposed to Lorelai, who was like, this just feels like a solution to a problem. I don't want it to be like that. It's very unromantic. It's too much pressure. I don't want to put that on you, and I certainly don't want to put it on me. So that's a major, major difference, because now Rory and Logan are 32. Well, they were 32. Now they're like 30, or a kindergartner basically. And it's a very different stage of life for them than it was with Lorelai raising Rory.
Mm-hmm. How do you think that translated into, I'm going to fast forward us a little bit here, but how do you think that translates into how we now get Rory as a woman in her early 30s in the revival? Do you see her paralleling Lorelai at that age now? Or do you see her deviating from Lorelai at 32 versus Rory at 32?
At 32, Lorelai was kicking ass and taking names. She was running the independents like clockwork. She was putting herself through school. She was talking with Suki about opening their own inn. She was making moves. She was trying to get into like relationships that were going somewhere. Rory at 32 is scrounging to put together like freelance jobs. She doesn't have a permanent address, which is fine. Again, like the nomad thing is totally doable and preferable for some people. So it's more just like she seems unhappy about it because she seemed comfy in Brooklyn, I guess, and was disappointed that she had to leave that. But she has a boyfriend that she constantly forgets about. Like, clearly she's not serious about this guy. She's jetting off to London every 5 minutes to pop in a quickie with Logan. Like, she's almost completely the opposite of Lorelai at 32. Lorelai was very like focused and practical and just had a view to the future, whereas Rory's like seemingly stuck in the past. She can't get over journalism. She can't get over Logan. She can't get over not being where she wants to be. And they're just nowhere near at the same place of life at that same age. And granted, Lorelai was obviously forced to grow up very fast, and you can't and shouldn't necessarily compare two people's lives at the same age, because any number of factors can go into changing that. But the gap between them is so vast that it's very noticeable. And that's, again, one of the reasons I have issue with people being like, well, Rory's just basically a mini Lorelai. Look at how different they are. Look at how wildly different their life circumstances are at these two ages. The world changed. They changed. And so it can't be such a neat simple comparison, like, oh, they're just the same person.
Mm-hmm. I do want us to get into talking about the men in both Rory and Lorelai's lives and how they can compare and contrast as well. But before we get there, I think this is a good point for me to ask this question. For all of the ways from birth, childhood, dating, education, teenage and formative years, career paths, all of the ways in which we've already illustrated in our minds how Lorelai and Rory are two very different women. I think the Gilmore Girls community at large seems to be so focused on paralleling these women and highlighting the similarities when we're trying to highlight the differences and make the counter argument. Why do you think the Gilmore Girls fandom and the fan base is so set on just making these two women the same person? And why are they so set? Like, why is the fandom so set on saying, like, no, like, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. In fact, it didn't even roll away. It's just these two women are the same. Why do you think so many Gilmore Girls fans are so set on making these two women exist as one and bringing all of these similarities to the forefront and making that argument?
I have a two-part answer to this one. I think part one is everything that Amy has said about the characters and how they interact and what the goal was with their relationship. And she's very explicit that it's meant to be a full circle kind of show. And the fact that the final 4 words were her plan from the get-go shows definitively that she always had it in mind that they would end up with very similar events happening in their lives. Like, I can't fully say that the trajectory was meant to be quite so similar, because it wasn't, especially after they left the show. But the events, especially like the pregnancy, the being an unwed mother, the baby kind of coming at a time when you're lost and needing something to provide you with meaning, which kind of problematic in itself, because you should be ready and willing to bring a child into the world and be ready to steward them through life, as opposed to like hoping that they'll fix you or that they'll teach you how to grow up. Yikes. But so I think that was baked into the premise from the very beginning, that, you know, part of their special relationship is that, you know, they're both witty, fast talkers who love pop culture and junk food, and they can share clothes, and they like all the same things. And so right there on the surface is that level of like, wow, they're like so much alike that even their eyes are basically the same. And then part 2 of my answer is that it feels nice, I think, to think that way, to think that that the parallels are there to find, and that therefore it will be satisfying when it's like, oh, we figured it out. Like, if this is happening for Lorelai, then this is what's going to happen for Rory. And it gives us this weird sense of understanding or finality, maybe, for Rory's storyline. It's like, well, we don't need to see the rest of her story because we saw what happened to Lorelai. So like, this is obviously a natural place to cut it off because we know what happens from here, except we really don't. The situations are incredibly different.
Yeah.
Do you have any other like thoughts on that? Do you have a different than I do?
No, it's pretty much in line with what you said and with what you thought. I don't want to tangentialize this too much, but again, like, this is another reason why I want a revival 2.0, because you want to talk about being able to either equate these two women or continue to make the argument that they are different and have that contrast be there. I want to see how Rory parents. I want to see how she raises her daughter. Does she fall in line with how Lorelai raised her, or does she go about it a completely different way? This entire conversation that we're having right now would be so much different than what it is if we had those answers and if we saw that. But we haven't gotten it yet, so I don't know. So I'm intrigued because I want to see how Rory parents in general and because I want more Gigi content. But I just want to have a more clear-cut answer to the question that we're even trying to pose tonight. Like, are these two women the same, or are they entirely different? And I feel like the parenting styles, we've talked about the difference between Emily parenting versus how Lorelai parented, and that's noteworthy. It's even going to be more telling to me if we were to see how Rory parented, and that would answer so many questions to what we're even trying to pose right now.
I agree. I want it. I need it. I got to see it. But that brings me to the next topic, which is more directly comparing the guys, because people love to do this. And they're not wrong. Like I said earlier, there are a lot of parallels, especially between Christopher and Logan. Like, they're very obvious for those two, especially. Like, they're both born and raised in Hartford. They're both sort of from that, like, upper crusty family with a lot of money and a lot of social prestige. They're both educated at fancy private schools or boarding schools. Then they were both kicked out of a lot of those schools, like to the point where they can sort of like commiserate about being kicked out of the same places. You know, they're both wealthy, worldly, handsome. They, you know, integrate well into the Gilmore lifestyle. They all met, well, I guess Chris and Lorelai met when they were like 6, so they go even way further back. Rory doesn't meet Logan, obviously, until Yale. And then, you know, obviously they're both the fathers of the daughters. They both moved to California to work in technology or, you know, computer stuff. Chris is more software, and Logan was, seems like, forefront of social media kind of stuff. And, you know, both were kissed by a Gilmore girl, both proposed to a Gilmore girl, both are obsessed with a Gilmore girl. You know, it's very much there for us to recognize how alike these two men are. But something I was thinking about earlier on this note is, like, it feels like Logan might be what might have happened with Lorelai and Chris had their circumstances been different. Like, if they had been able to finish high school and graduate, have a traditional college experience, travel Europe together, maybe live together at some point, if they had stayed together and done the whole college thing instead of getting pregnant, and they had waited until later for Chris to eventually propose marriage instead of it just being the solution to the problem of like the right thing to do when it came to Lorelai's pregnancy, it might have been very different. It's almost like Rory is getting what Lorelai didn't in that way. It's like fitting for Rory's most serious relationship to mirror the one Lorelai had with her dad in those ways, but it shows the importance of timing and circumstance and how that plays on the outcome of a situation. So I think that their relationships with those men are very different because they met later and they had an opportunity to do things with their lives first, and it didn't hamstring them with them being so young. You know, now they're in their 30s and they're in a much better position to have a kid. And I don't think that Christopher not being the one for Lorelai means that Logan is not the one for Rory. So I think that's, like, again, so many parallels, but I don't think it has to be determinative of Rory's ultimate outcome, because if she's happy with Logan and she wants to raise her daughter with him, I'm for it, as long as Logan isn't a total piece of crap, which we haven't seen how he parents either. I mean, there's a difference between like how you view his social behaviors and his, like, you know, how he spends his money, or obviously there's the cheating thing, which we'll dig into. But I mean, like, in terms of the kind of love and support he shows to his kid, and whether he commits to Rory in the end and stops with the sort of like bachelor lifestyle that he's been living, and whether he's actually a good dad, because I think he would be a better dad than he had. And so as long as he's not abusive and their relationship can be healthy, like I think Logan deserves a chance to be to their daughter what Christopher never was for Rory. And I think that's kind of what I would like to see from this full circle story, is the sort of like this progression. Like there can be some similarity, but there needs to be growth in that. And I think that a fitting outcome would be for both Rory and Logan to grow and to step up and to fix the issues that they have both individually and as a couple, to be better for their daughter and to provide her a stable household and a good influence.
Yeah. I mean, I want it to, and like now I'm just sitting here thinking about it, even from the perspective of, we've talked about the differences between how Lorelai parented and how Emily parented, but now I'm even thinking about things from like the Hayden side of the family. Like, you know, what was Logan's upbringing like? You know, how was he raised? He was obviously groomed to, you know, be the man, and we've talked about this previously. But just to, you know, take on the Huntsberger name and like, you know, run with the mantle of like, you're the family, you're the heir, and you're like, you know, the dynasty and the end all be all, and, you know, Honor can go just live her life. But I even see his parents just being like, you know, you're it because you're the dude, so run with it. And this, you know, family legacy is going to exist and carry on through you. I would love to see how Logan parents, if it's a departure from how he was raised, and if he's able to do better than what he got, especially because he has a daughter. We obviously will not, like, Amy has indicated to us that Rory is pregnant with a girl. Again, leading into the full circle moment, I believe that's probably true. Like Rory is about, like, Rory will have a daughter. But with Logan having a daughter now, I just think to Mitchum being like, well, should I entrust this girl and this child to lead the Huntsberger family into the future? Or would Mitchum be like, cool, son, why don't you try for a boy?
That's an excellent question. And I don't want to know the answer because I don't want Mitchum having that much say in Rory's reproductive life. But I mean, the points you made there made me think Logan is almost as much like Lorelai as he is like Chris. There's a lot of similarities there as well. They both grew up in difficult homes and were in gilded cages. You know, it sounds nice to have all that privilege, but it can be very emotionally and mentally traumatizing to people. You know, it's a hard way to grow up. And I think sometimes we like to judge Logan as an individual for things that he was enabled to do from the day he was born. You know, like it was a system that created Logan. It's not that he's like uniquely a terrible person, but he was raised in a very specific way. And unlike Lorelai, he sort of accepted it or didn't try to get out as soon. But, you know, they both have difficult parents. They come from financial privilege. They express derision for the uber wealthy, even though Logan accepts that more than Lorelai did. Lorelai was just like, I don't want any part of this. And Logan's like, I'm just going to be really irreverent about this and, you know, steal trinkets from one rich person's house and bring them to the next rich person's house. Both of them derived benefits from their financial privilege, whether or not they want to admit it, especially Lorelai. They're both kind of rebellious and impulsive. Logan eventually does try to spit out the sterling silver Royal Danish in his mouth, although that was backtracked, unfortunately, in the revival. But again, it's just a lot of a lot of similarities in their upbringings that allows Lorelai to see something of herself in Logan when he comes to her in season 7. And she can really relate. And even in season 6, when Mitchum shows up to Martha's Vineyard and pulls Logan out of the house, and she's like, I know what it's like to be a disappointment to your parents. Like, I'm sorry, and I feel for you right now. She understands him, and he understands what she went through as well. And I think that makes them an interesting dynamic or an interesting pair to compare. And Jess also has some similarities to Lorelai. People have pointed out plenty of those. So what do you think about the idea that Jess is Rory's Luke?
Gag me.
I mean, same.
You do.
I hate it.
I've said this before, and I will say it again. You do every single person in this show an incredible disservice when you start making these parallels, because it strips them of every ounce of autonomy and individuality that they have. And nothing will cause me, it's not causing me sleepless nights, but like nothing will cause me more sleepless nights than that. Because you have to be respective and notice a person's individuality. And when you start making these parallels, and I get that the fandom is doing it at large, it makes me sick, because you're taking a human being, and granted it's a fictional human being, but you're taking a person and you're stripping them of all of that autonomy and that individuality that they have. And they're saying, you're exactly like your mother, or you're exactly like your father, or you're exactly like your uncle. And it's so diminishing. Like, there are always going to be similarities and overlaps, especially when you're talking about family and biology is coming into play. In its own nature, like that's what biology is. It's similarities within DNA and gene pools, and potentially that can translate into personality traits, and that stems from upbringing. All of that is going to be there and is going to be present. But when you start saying that these two people are exactly the same and that one is the other, it's the most egregious thing that I think you can do to any individual, because you're just saying that you're not recognizing them for who they are at that point, and you're just making them and comparing them to someone else. And when you do that, you're never recognizing, again, the individuality and the uniqueness of that person. And I think nothing is more detrimental to any one person who could be on the receiving end of that, because that will just always make them feel and potentially even believe that they're just, one, like, just, I don't know how better to put it, but that they're just in a school of fish where, like, they're not meant to be seen. They're just meant to exist. You need to strip all of that, take that all away, and say, yeah, they might have one or two things in common with their parent or with their family member or with this other person. But for every one or two things they have in common, there's 100 or 1,000 more things that they don't have in common. And all of those things are what I think we should be focusing on, because that's what makes them the unique and beautiful person that they are. Don't focus on the one or two things that are similar. Focus on what makes a person unique.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to talking about Luke and Jess as it relates to Lorelai and Rory, is that basically the only thing they have in common is that that they have Dane's ancestry, because Jess's last name isn't even Dane's, and that they're both obsessed with the Gilmore Girl. Luke was born and raised in Stars Hollow, small town. He stays there his whole life. He is very connected to the place through his parents, whereas Jess was born and raised in New York, and he comes to Stars Hollow and is like, Elvis Costello's This Is Hell is playing in my head right now. He thinks it's weird and full of jerks. He only stuck around as long as he did because he liked Rory, but it was certainly not the place that he saw himself staying forever. Luke only finished high school. Jess was a neglected, gifted child and doesn't finish high school at all and just goes off to work in publishing eventually. Like, he has a few other jobs, and obviously there's the California stint, but he was always so financially unstable that he was worried about that from an early age, whereas Luke wasn't. Jess reads a lot, and Luke is almost anti-intellectual. We hardly ever see him reading unless it's like a guidebook to walking tours of New York. Luke's relationship with his parents is very different. He was very fond of his parents. He did whatever he could to honor them in their memory. He has a dark day every year on the anniversary of his father's death, whereas Jess thinks his mom is a nut job and just pushes her away. He eventually makes peace with her and is sort of like accepting of her and TJ, but it takes him a lot of work to be able to sort of forgive him for the neglect he felt in his childhood, which isn't something that Luke can really relate to. He has so much nostalgia for his family in his childhood that Jess just doesn't hold. And, Luke started his own business, whereas Jess joined somebody else's business. I don't know if he's entrepreneur. It's hard to say because he's mostly just working for other people that we see, but at least he goes out and does stuff for himself, even if it's not like starting a whole business like a diner. But that's one other thing they have in common is that they're both like emotionally unavailable and immature. They both take that self-help book and try to do something for themselves. But they're cynical and they're angry and they're resentful in different ways. Luke is kind of, I hesitate to say all-American, but he's very like typically masculine. He was on the track team. He dresses very just like, jeans and a flannel. And Jess is like a prototypical bad boy. They have very different personalities and traits and beliefs, attitudes about the world, educational backgrounds, career backgrounds, and relationship backgrounds. And so I don't know why we're comparing them so directly when, like, of all the people on the show, they're like the two most polar opposite.
Yeah, I agree. Luke and Jess are two very different people. Why are we comparing them? I don't know. I understand the need and the desire to want to find similarity because it feels more, I don't know, just maybe we want to be bringing us together and bringing our characters together in that way, as opposed to divisiveness. But we're not doing it to be divisive. We're doing it to be individualistic. So I think it's good to want to see similarities, but it's unhealthy when we start making one equal the other. And I feel like that's potentially what this fandom does a bit too much. And I don't love it because, again, it just strips any one of our characters of individuality.
Yeah, but I think there is some like satisfaction in spotting it and being like that meme of Leonardo DiCaprio where he's like, huh? And like points, and he like the recognition. Yeah. There is something like a little shot of dopamine or something that you get when you're like, oh, I see what they did there. But again, I really don't like it when it's prescriptive on the characters to follow the exact same path, because that's not a good story. That's not how you write stories. You can weave in these parallels without having it be so straightforward, because once you do that, you're telegraphing your ending. And a story that has an ending that's telegraphed like that often isn't satisfying. And I think a lot of people feel that. Some people love the revival. But I would say I got 60-40, 70-30, where people are like, I really didn't like the way that they portrayed the characters in the revival, and I don't like how it ended, because it, like, something feels missing or wrong with that particular ending, because it's like, in a way we saw it coming. Like, it's one thing to foreshadow stuff and to lay the foundation for an ending, and it's another to telegraph it and be like, this is how it ends, here it is on a silver platter.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise, why would you even read to the end of the story if you know how it's going to end?
Yeah, exactly. As we wind down on this one, I want to circle back to our two Gilmore Girl women and perhaps close this out with this question, which I'm stealing from you. This was your thought, but I'm going to ask it of you anyway. When Rory is graduating Chilton and she's having that speech, she highlights authors that were important to her, books that have shaped her, but the crux of that speech is that it's her saying to Lorelai, who is sitting right there in the audience, I don't think that my mother ever even really realized that all this time the person that I really wanted to be was her. What do you think Rory meant by that?
That's a great question, she says, because she came up with the question herself. Yeah. I think what she was trying to get at there was that she was raised by a woman who was strong and independent and had a real sense of self, a strong set of values that she lived by and adhered to in spite of pressures coming at her from the outside world. She marched to the beat of her own drum. She accomplished a lot. Whatever she set her mind to, she could do. She was empathetic and open-minded and supportive. She was tenacious at building a life for them. And she did it all while contributing to the community, while being beloved by their friends and neighbors, and just being very, like, competent and charming. There are a lot of nice things I could say about Lorelai. And I think Rory was admiring just how strong Lorelai is as a person. Sometimes that's well to her benefit, and other times it might lead to her being a little stubborn. Two sides of the same coin. The dose makes the poison. But on the whole, Rory saw a woman as her primary female role model who was just so good at making it happen and just never giving up. She really admired that about her, I think. Do you have any different takes or anything to add?
A lot of what you just said, I think it was also about the fact that her mother made her life her own, and that she was strong in a way that, like, her strength was just something that was innately in her. And she didn't need to rely on anybody else to achieve her goals, to accomplish what she wanted to. She didn't have to fall back on the safety net that was Emily and Richard. Her mother was probably the strongest person that Rory had ever known at that point, and probably the strongest person that she will ever know. And going back to something that you said before, like, Lorelai just, took names, kicked ass. She didn't need anybody else to be successful. She just made her success her own. And I think Rory saw the strength that her mother embodied and was just always in awe of it, and just wanting to have that be passed on and make that strength her own. Because Lorelai led life by her own terms. She didn't ask questions of other people in terms of, do you think this is right? Should I do this? She always answered those questions for herself, and her strength was just something that was so innate and a part of her being that Rory, even as her daughter, was just like, I want to be like my mother because she's the most fearless and courageous person that I've ever known. And if I can live my life even marginally, acquiring some of that for myself, hopefully it will lead me to the success and the happiness that I've seen my mother have in her life. That didn't immediately work out for Rory. But I think she was at least acknowledging that her mother had a really strong skill set, really admirable qualities, and just a good notion and a good mindset of how to achieve in life and how to be successful and happy without necessarily relying on others to do so. And when you can just draw on that inner strength, I think for anybody, it's going to just always be helpful to you. So I think she was just admiring her mother for the strong and independent woman that Lorelai had always been at that point, and just wanting some, if not all of that for herself.
I also agree with that. And I think that kind of puts a capper on this, because if Lorelai gets to be a strong, independent woman who determines success on her own terms, Rory should be allowed to do that too. And so constantly falling into the traps and making the same mistakes as her parents doesn't feel like a satisfying ending for her. If she's going to be anything like her mom, if she's going to be fearless and blaze her own path, she has to do this parenting thing her own way, and she needs to learn and grow and build her own life without living too much in her mother's shadow.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I think that is a really good capper on this. I will say, obviously, the fandom might still have differing thoughts. You might still think Lorelai and Rory are the same person, or that their parallels are more than what we've given them credit for. If you have thoughts, drop us a comment. If you disagree, we want to know about it. This is what we're doing this for. We want to hear what other people think. So, yeah, leave us your thoughts if you have them. In the meantime, what's coming up next for us on the Gilmore Way?
I'm very excited about what's coming up, because I've literally been working on the script since we started talking about doing this podcast last winter. Mm-hmm. It is one of those series spanning topics that will prompt some incredible discussion. We're talking about food, y'all. For the next 2 weeks, we are having a two-parter kind of discussion about food on the show and the role it plays both in real life and on TV. And for these girls specifically, we're going to be talking about diet culture and fat phobia and exercise. And we're going to be doing it, at least partially. I don't want to spoil too much or overpromise, but at least one of the weeks, if not both, we will have a very special guest. Larissa from Even Gilmore is going to join us on the podcast. So we're very excited to have her. We're very excited to have this conversation. Like I said, I have a lot of thoughts. I've been working on this one for well over a year. My notes document is huge. Brace yourself, because I have a lot to say about the Gilmore gastronomy.
Yeah. I am equally as excited to have Larissa come on and talk with us. She has done so much in terms of just putting together recipes, talking about how food is represented on the show, all of that. So we are just so excited to have her on and talk with us. If you're not already following her on social media, please go check her out in the lead up to that episode. She's got so much wonderful content for anyone to digest, pun intended, and absorb. So we're elated to have her come speak with us, and we hope that you will come back and check out that episode, because we're just thrilled to be able to talk with her. In the meantime, go back and watch some of our old videos. One of the ones that we most recently did was a FanFest special episode where we were just honored to have Jenny, who is the organizer of FanFest, come on and talk with us. And we also had the pleasure of speaking with Jess and her husband Charlie, who are 2 FanFest attendees who have been going to that event for quite a few years now. So we were able to sit down and talk with them about what FanFest is like. If you're not familiar with FanFest or the upcoming Firelight event that's taking place in Maine this fall, please go back and watch that episode to get more information on it. And if you're not already attending or planning to attend that event, please buy a ticket to FanFest. It is essentially a Gilmore Girls convention weekend. There are cast members and behind the scenes people from the show that will be attending. Kate and I will be there. Numerous other just super fans, and it's just going to be the most incredible weekend. So please go back and watch that video and consider buying a ticket to the event if you have not already done so.
Yeah, I echo all those sentiments. I am so stoked for Maine from September 28th to October 1st. Yeah. I am counting down the days. We are just shy of 15 weeks out now, so it's coming up. Make sure to grab your ticket. Book your accommodations ASAP because it will be leaf peeping season in Maine. It doesn't get better than that. Do it.
It's not. Yep. We'll have links in the description below to where you can buy tickets to that event. Please go check it out. Again, you will not be disappointed. If you have any questions about that event or any of our own personal material, you can always drop us a comment, email us, check us out on social media. Again, links to all of that is in the description below. And please just remember to always do those YouTube-y things for us. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel. It's one click and it really does help us out. And we're always so just appreciative and grateful for it. But come back next week where we'll be talking about food and all of that fun stuff. We've got a really just good slate of episodes coming. So we hope that you'll join us for all of it. Until then,
literally next week. Weekend. We will see you.
We will see you for Friday night dinner.
For dinner.
Until then, have a good weekend. And yeah. See you next week.
Cheers.
For Friday night dinner. Yep. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.